Good afternoon. I'm David Remnick, editor of The New Yorker. I want to welcome you to what, alas, is the final event of a terrific weekend at the New Yorker Festival. And I want to thank all of you for coming to this event, and I even presume some more events. So thank you very much for that. It's my great privilege, well, first of all, it's my great privilege to ask you to turn off whatever phone you might have. And in a contradiction in terms, you should also know that the hashtag for tweeting is TNYFest. So you figure out whether you should keep it on or off. At the very least, silence it. It's my great honor to be in this room for two reasons. Not first and foremost is that my late great-grandmother lived around the block, and I've seen hundreds of movies in this theater. And I remember one in particular very distinctly. I took her to see a film called Our Man Flint when I was 8 years old, or maybe she took me. And I remember distinctly on this screen, Our Man Flint was like a takeoff on James Bond, and only people of a certain age will remember this film. And I remember very distinctly 20 women all at once taking off their bikini tops, and my grandmother's expression, which is called an aneurysm. Related to freedom of expression, I want to welcome a real hero of freedom of expression and literature, Salman Rushdie. Salman, as you know, is the author of 11 novels, including Midnight's Children, Shame, The Moor's Last Sigh, The Enchantress of Florence. He has won the Booker Prize for Fiction, the Best of the Booker Award, and his novel, which we'll talk about, Midnight's Children, has been adapted for film. I had the privilege of seeing it recently. It's an extraordinary movie. I wouldn't have thought it possible at all. It's an absolutely beautiful movie. Joseph Anton, his new memoir about his years of struggle against the Iranian fatwa on his novel and on himself, on the Satanic Verses and on Salman, is out now. It is number 3 on the bestseller list, and as soon as it shoves aside 2 more, it'll be on the top. It's a source of pride that he's been contributing to The New Yorker since 1987. The literary brilliance of Joseph Anton cannot be underestimated, and neither can its importance as a document about freedom of expression, freedom of the individual. And I don't think it was any plan of Salman's, to say the least, but this book really joins the work of people like Joseph Brodsky and Sinyavsky and Danielle and Havel as one of the most important documents that we have about the importance of individual and also communal courage in the face of cruelty and ignorance, in the face of a great imagination. I welcome Salman Rushdie, who's going to begin by reading from Joseph Anton, and then we'll have a conversation, and then we'll have some questions from you. Salman.
Well, those are great names to be bracketed with. Thank you, David. You know, my life kind of turned into a parody of a James Bond movie, too. But the thing with the girls in the bikinis did not happen. I'm sorry to report. I'm just going to read a little bit which comes from a bit where I'm talking about having studied the origin story of Islam at Cambridge University, and this is sort of the bit where I first found out about the so-called incident of the Satanic Verses. It's describing Makkah and Medina as it was in the middle of the 7th century. They were nomads who had just begun to settle down. Their cities were new. Makkah was only a few generations old. Yathrib, later renamed Medina, was a group of encampments around an oasis without so much as a serious city wall. They were still uneasy in their new urbanized lives, and the changes made many of them unhappy. A nomadic society was conservative, full of rules, valuing the well-being of the group more highly than individual liberty. But it was also inclusive. The nomadic world had been a matriarchy. Under the umbrella of its extended families, even orphan children could find protection and a sense of identity and belonging. All that was changing now. The city was a patriarchy, and its preferred family unit was nuclear. The crowd of the disenfranchised grew larger and more restive every day. But Mecca was prosperous, and its ruling elders liked it that way. Inheritance now followed the male line. This, too, the governing families preferred. At the gates to the city stood temples to three goddesses, Al-Lat, Al-Manat, and Al-Uzza, winged goddesses like exalted birds or angels. Each time the trading caravans from which the city gained its wealth left the city gates or came back through them, they paused at one of the temples and made an offering, or, to use modern language, paid a tax. The wealthiest families in Mecca controlled the temples, and much of their wealth came from these offerings. The winged goddesses were at the heart of the economy of the new city, of the urban civilization that was coming into being. In the building known as the Cube, or Kaaba, in the center of town, there were idols of hundreds of gods. One of these statues, by no means the most popular, represented a deity called Allah, meaning the god, just as Al-Lat was the goddess. Allah was unusual in that he didn't specialize. He wasn't a rain god or a wealth god or a war god or a love god. He was just vaguely an everything god. It may be that this failure to specialize explained his relative unpopularity. People making offerings to gods usually did so for specific reasons: the health of a child, the future of a business enterprise, a drought, a quarrel, a romance. They preferred gods who were experts in their field to this non-specific all-rounder of a deity. However, Allah was about to become more popular than any pagan deity had ever been. The man who would pluck Allah from near obscurity and become his prophet, transforming him into the equal or at least equivalent of the Old Testament God I Am and the New Testament's 3-in-1, was Muhammad ibn Abdullah of the Banu Hashim family, which had fallen in his childhood upon hard times, an orphan living in his uncle's house. As a teenager, he began to journey with that uncle, Abu Talib, on his trading journeys to Syria. On those journeys, he almost certainly encountered his first Christians, adherents of the Nestorian sect, and heard their stories, many of which adapted Old and New Testament stories to fit in with local conditions. According to the Nestorians, for example, Jesus Christ was born in an oasis under a palm tree. Later in the Quran, the Archangel Gabriel revealed to Muhammad the surah known as Maryam, Mary, in which Jesus is born in a palm tree, under a palm tree in an oasis. Muhammad ibn Abdullah grew up with a reputation as a skilled merchant and honest man, and at the age of 25, this brought him a marriage proposal from an older, wealthier woman, Khadija. And in the next 15 years, he was successful in business and happy in his marriage. However, he was clearly a man with a need for solitude, and for many years would spend weeks at a time living like a hermit in a cave on Mount Hira. When he was 40 years old, the angel Gabriel disturbed his solitude there and ordered him to recite. Naturally, he immediately believed he had lost his mind and fled. He only returned to hear what the angel had to say when his wife and close friends persuaded him that it might be worth a return trip up the mountain, just in case, that it was probably a good idea to check if God was really trying to get in touch. It was easy to admire much of what followed as the merchant transformed himself into the messenger of God. Easy to sympathize with his persecution and eventual flight to Medina, and to respect his rapid evolution at the oasis community of Yathrib into respected lawgiver, able ruler, and skilled military leader. It was also easy to see how the world into which the Quran was revealed and the events in the life of the messenger directly influenced the revelation. When Muslim men were killed in battle, the angel was prompt to encourage their brothers to marry their widows, in order that the bereaved women might not be lost to the faith by remarrying outside it. When the Prophet's beloved Aisha was rumored to have behaved inappropriately while lost in the desert with a certain Safwan ibn Marwan, the angel of the Lord came down in some haste to point out that no, in God's opinion, the virtuous lady had not fooled around. Here was a fascinating paradox, that an essentially conservative theology, looking backwards with affection towards a vanishing culture, became a revolutionary idea because the people whom it attracted most strongly were those who had been marginalized by urbanization, the disaffected poor, the street mob. This perhaps was why Islam, the new idea, felt so threatening to the Meccan elite, why it was persecuted so viciously, and why its founder may, just may, have been offered an attractive deal designed to buy him off. The historical record was incomplete, but most of the major collections of hadiths or traditions about the life of the Prophet, those compiled by Ibn Ishaq, Waqidi, Ibn Sa'd, Bukhari, and Tabari, told the story of an incident that afterwards became known as the incident of the Satanic Verses. The Prophet came down from the mountain one day and recited the surah number 53 called An-Najm, the Star. It contained these words: "Have you heard of Al-Lat and Al-Uzza and Al-Manat, the third, the other one? They are the exalted birds, and their intercession is greatly to be desired." At a later point, was it days later or weeks or months, he returned to the mountain and came down abashed to state that he had been deceived on his previous visit. The devil had appeared to him in the guise of the archangel, and the verses he had been given were therefore not divine but satanic and should be expunged from the Quran at once. The angel had on this occasion brought new verses from God which were to replace the satanic verses in the great book. "Have you heard of Al-Lat and Al-Uzza and Al-Manat, the third, the other one? They are but names that your forefathers invented, and there is no truth in them. Shall God have daughters while you have sons? That would be an unjust division." And in this way, the recitation was purified of the devil's work. But the questions remained: why did Muhammad initially accept the first false revelation as true? And what happened in Mecca in the period between the two revelations, satanic and angelic? This much was known. Muhammad wanted to be accepted by the people of Mecca. He longed, Ibn Ishaq wrote, for a way to attract them. And when the people heard that he had accepted the three-winged goddesses, the news was popular. They were delighted and greatly pleased at the way in which he spoke of their gods, Ibn Ishaq wrote, saying, "Muhammad has spoken of our gods in splendid fashion." And Bukhari reported, "The Prophet prostrated while reciting An-Najm, and with him prostrated the Muslims, the pagans, the jinns, and all human beings." Why then did the Prophet afterwards recant? Western historians, the Scottish scholar of Islam W. Montgomery Watt, the French Marxist Maxime Rodinson, proposed a politically motivated reading of the episode. The temples of the three-winged goddesses were economically important to the city's ruling elite, an elite from which Muhammad was excluded, unfairly in his opinion. So perhaps the deal that was offered ran something like this: if Muhammad or the Archangel Gabriel or Allah could agree that the bird goddesses could be worshipped by followers of Islam, not as the equals of Allah, obviously, but as secondary, lesser beings, like, for example, angels. And there already were angels in Islam, so what harm could there be in adding three more who just happened to be popular and lucrative figures in Mecca? Then the persecution of Muslims would cease, and Muhammad himself would be granted a seat on the city's ruling council. And it was perhaps to this temptation that the Prophet briefly succumbed. Then what happened? Did the city's grandees renege on the deal, reckoning that by flirting with polytheism, Muhammad had undone himself in the eyes of his followers? Did the followers refuse to accept the revelation about the goddesses? Did Muhammad himself regret having compromised his idea by yielding to the siren call of acceptability? It was not possible to say for sure. Imagination had to fill the gaps in the record. But the Quran spoke of how all the prophets had been tested by temptation. "Never have we sent a single prophet or apostle before you with whose wishes Satan did not tamper," it said in Surah 22. And if the incident of the satanic verses was the temptation of Muhammad, it had to be said that he came out of it pretty well. He both confessed to having been tempted and also repudiated that temptation. Tabari quotes him thus: "I have fabricated things against God, and I have imputed to him words which he has not spoken." After that, the monotheism of Islam, having been tested in the cauldron, remained unwavering and strong in spite of persecution, exile, and war, and before long the Prophet had the victory over his enemies, and the new faith spread like a conquering fire across the world. Shall God have daughters while you have sons? That would be an unjust division. The true verses, angelic or divine, were clear. It was the femaleness of the winged goddesses, the exalted birds, that rendered them inferior and fraudulent and proved they could not be the children of God as the angels were. Sometimes the birth of a great idea revealed things about its future. The way in which newness enters the world prophesied how it would behave when it grew old. At the birth of this particular idea, femaleness was seen as a disqualification from exaltation. Good story, he thought when he read about it. Even then he was dreaming of being a writer, and he filed the good story away in the back of his mind for future consideration. 20 years later, he would find out exactly how good a story it was.
Salman, as I understand it, you grew up in a house that was not especially religious at all.
Yeah.
What was the attitude toward Islam in your household?
Well,
and religious practice?
You know, there was the only religious practice really was that we did not eat the flesh of the swine. No pig was essentially as far as Islam got into our house, because my mother didn't like it. Every so often, I mean, like not even all the time, every so often my father would take me to the big Eid prayers and just tell me to go up and down when everybody else went up and down. And that was it. There was one attempt by my mother, I think, to hire a religious teacher to instruct me and my sisters. I was kind of dreadful goody-goody as a kid, made up for it later. But my sisters were kind of much more mischievous than I, and they started poking fun at him, at the teacher, and he complained to my mother that the children were insufficiently respectful. And unfortunately, my parents took our side, and the teacher got fired, and that was the end of religious instruction. So,
but how did you absorb the history and the stories of Islam?
Well, because my father was really interested. You know, that's the interesting thing about him, is that he was completely lacking in religious belief, but he was really interested in it as a subject. So he was much more scholarly than me because he could speak Arabic and Farsi.
What did he do?
Well, I mean, my father was inherited a lot of money. My grandfather was in the textile business and made a lot of money and died young, and my father was the only son and inherited it. Then he made that money even bigger by some shrewd investing in the property market around the time of independence. And then he spent the rest of his life losing all the money. So when he died, which was in 1987, he was absolutely flat broke. I mean, when I had to go and look at his affairs, there was no money in any of the bank accounts. And in the top left-hand drawer of his desk, there were sort of blocks of rupee notes, which were basically all the money he had left in the world.
So when you were sent abroad to boarding school in England and then to Cambridge, did you think you were going to live the life of a wealthy man's son?
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, first of all, I had no expectation of doing anything other than going back to India. You know, and I didn't
to be.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I was early rebellious. I mean, I thought, you know, the textile industry and property speculation didn't sound like
fun.
What I wanted to do.
Yeah.
But my father said, now, when I was the only son, I had 3 sisters, my father assumed that I would take over the family business and was very, very disappointed when I graduated from university and not only said that I didn't want to do it, but then said this terrible thing, which is that I wanted to be a writer. And this cry burst out of him. Really, he couldn't restrain himself. He said, "What will I tell my friends?" And I mean, you know, fortunately, he lived long enough for his friends to start calling him up and congratulating him. So I think he worked out that maybe it wasn't a completely dumb idea.
But when you were at school and in England and then university, were you reading heavily into the history of and the texts of Islam?
Not in school, no, not at school, not till I got to university. At school, I was mostly reading science fiction novels.
So you were a serious student.
Sort of same thing.
Yeah.
And no, when I got to university, I mean, I did a degree in history. And in the final year of the Cambridge University history degree, you're asked to choose 3 special subjects.
Right.
And just do that, nothing else. And there were these three, it seemed to me, unusually interesting centuries. One was Indian history from 1857, which was the so-called Indian Mutiny, until independence in 1947, that 90-year period, which of course afterwards became really useful when I was writing Midnight's Children.
Served you well.
The second was American history from the Declaration of Independence until the end of Reconstruction, so 1776 to 1877. Also, amazing century, you know. And the third was Muhammad and the rise of Islam. And so I studied that, and that's where I found out.
And there was never any tinge along the way of edging into religious belief?
No. I mean, I say in the book, there's this moment when I first went to boarding school, and, you know, as I say, I had not ever in my life eaten the flesh of the swine. And I thought,
there was
okay,
an incident.
My mother's not here now. So I went to the school shop and bought a ham sandwich, which I, with enormous ritual and slightly scared, consumed. And, you know, no Thunderbolt.
And pretty good, too.
And it was a pretty lousy ham sandwich, but it felt amazing at the time.
I know the feeling.
And no Thunderbolt. And so, yeah. And so I thought that was the moment at which I realized that God did not exist.
Now,
it's all about ham.
Now, it's not as if Satanic Verses was the first book of yours to make a little trouble. I mean, your view of Indian history, your view of Pakistan and the subsequent novel Shame, certainly brought upon you what in terms of critical opprobrium or nervousness?
Well, I mean, not critical, because I think both those books were pretty well received.
I don't mean literary.
Oh, literary. No, non-literary critical opprobrium. Yeah, well, the problem with Shame is that one of the characters was based on the then dictator of Pakistan, Zia-ul-Haq, and he was still in power. So he wasn't fond of it. And banned it. And interestingly, I discovered afterwards that quite large numbers of copies of Shame got into Pakistan through diplomatic pouches. That for some reason the diplomatic community decided that everybody should, you know, working at embassies should read it. So they smuggled in lots of books through the diplomatic pouch, and then sort of they'd spread out into the society. So that was an interesting use of the diplomatic bag as a way of countering censorship. Midnight's Children, I just had this problem with Mrs. Gandhi where she tried to sue me. And
because of the passages about the emergency?
No, not, you know, oddly you would think, but no, it was because there's one sentence in the book in which I repeated a thing that people used to say about Mrs. Gandhi, which is that her son, Sanjay, used to blame her for the early death of his father for a heart seizure because she had separated from him. And because he would blame her for his father's death, she was sort of at his mercy and would deny him nothing and would let him get away with everything he did. This was, I mean, commonplace saying in those days. That's it. And what is interesting is that when I first wrote the novel and showed it to the British publishers, you know, they were a little bit nervous about this or that because, after all, the Prime Minister of India was sort of the villain of the novel. And they asked me to, you know, to provide supporting evidence. And I did. And I said, you know, this sentence comes from this and this from this. And I gave them,
to the lawyers you were providing?
Yeah, to the publishers and their lawyers. And I said in this like 8-page letter or something, I said there's this one sentence which I can't justify because it's about 3 people and 2 of them are dead, and the third is the one who would be suing you.
Right.
But I said this has been in the papers very often. It's been repeated in print many times before, and she's never sued anybody. So it seems to me we're probably okay. And they agreed to that. And then some years later, that was the sentence that she sued about. So it seemed to me clear that she'd had somebody read the book, and they'd come up with the same sentence as the weak point, you know.
But I ask this, Salman, as a kind of preface to when you sit down to write the Satanic Verses, you're not unconscious of the fact that
there's been trouble before.
That there's been trouble before. What did you anticipate when you took on these stories and played around them in a fictive way?
I didn't expect a lot, really. I tell you
maybe you should maybe also set the scene of where we were in the world at that time in terms of Islam and its. Well,
this was the book came out in 1988, and I suppose I started writing it in around 1984, probably. And the world was very different. I mean, let's say the Khomeini revolution had happened. I mean, that was 1979. But, you know, I mean, the Khomeini revolution was Iran. I thought, what do I have to do with Iran? You know, it's not, I'm not even from a Shia Muslim family. It's got nothing to do with me. Also, I think I was buoyed up very much by the success of Midnight's Children and Shame, you know, which had really done a lot to, you know, establish me as a writer. And I was feeling, you know, they'd both been colossally successful commercially and so on. And I thought, you know, I thought I could actually try and write a very difficult book. I mean, after all, the Satanic Verses is quite formally complicated and so on. It's not the kind of book that you write ordinarily if you're trying to write a bestseller. You know? But I thought, well, they've got all these readers, you know, maybe they'll come along for the ride and I can try and do something difficult and ambitious, you know. Right. And that was sort of the going-in spirit of it. And, you know, I showed the book to various people in manuscript. I remember showing it to Edward Said at Columbia and saying, what do you think? And he read it and he said, well, Salman, the mullahs aren't going to like it. And I said, yeah, but they never liked anything else I wrote.
Right.
And he went, you know, I mean, both of us thought, you know, we're not writing for the mullahs. You know, if you were writing, I mean, what is worse than a bad review from the Ayatollah Khomeini would be a good review. Exactly. You know? So it struck me that, you know, how many mullahs are going to read a 600-page novel in English? You know, and yes, maybe there'll be a few people yelling and screaming, but fine.
Right.
You know, and that's sort of what I thought would happen.
Had there been any precedent to trouble from novels from the West, I mean, or from South Asia?
You know, there had been a little, I mean, I found out a lot about this afterwards. I mean, there had been attacks against writers in various Arab countries. But I mean, at the time, I was pretty much unaware of that, you know, because I'm not from the Arab world. You know, I was from, I mean, India, free democratic society, you know, living in England, another free democratic society, and I thought, I'm just writing a book here, you know. And as I say, I assumed that conservative Muslim figures wouldn't like it. And I thought, so what?
So the book is published, and on Valentine's Day, 1989, tell us what happened. This is the beginning of the
well, there had been an escalating argument, but the book had come out. It's different, you see, because it came out in England 6 months earlier. It came out in England in September '88. It didn't come out here until after the fatwa. So very different climate when it was published here. But in England, it had been out for 6 months. And in those 6 months, yes, there had been a kind of escalating argument about it. And I'd been taking part in that. I'd been, you know, writing articles and going on radio and television and so on, and, you know, arguing my side against people who disagreed. And there was a bit of me that thought this is all right, actually. I mean, it's one of the things that books can sometimes usefully do, is to start difficult conversations, you know.
And it was on the level of what? Things on the radio, in the papers?
Yeah, radio, television, newspapers.
But nothing scary?
No, nobody thought it was frightening. And then various things happened which began to change the climate. One is that exactly 1 month before the fatwa, January the 14th, 1989, was what became the famous book burning in Bradford in Yorkshire, north of England, which is the town with the largest Muslim population. And I remember just the feeling of revulsion when I saw these images of my book set on fire. Not just set on fire, first nailed to a post and then set on fire. So first crucified and then burned. I just thought this is a disgusting image. And it was surrounded by people looking really smug and pleased with themselves. I remember there was one particular gentleman in these famous photographs, whatever, wearing a little pork pie hat and a sort of little Poirot moustache and looking fabulously pleased with himself. And I thought, you know, I'd like to smack you upside the head. You know? Anyway, so I got very, after that, let's say, the climate change became nastier. And then there were demonstrations in India and Pakistan, and they became violent, and suddenly it was beginning to get dangerous.
And did you change the way you were living your life in that?
Not at that time, no, not really. And then on this particular day, 14th, Valentine's Day, 1989, 14th of February, I just got phoned at home. I got called at home by a woman from the BBC who told me, who said, how does it feel to know that you've just been condemned to death by the Ayatollah Khomeini?
Great.
Yeah. I thought that's a hell of a question on Valentine's Day. And I said something stupid like it doesn't feel good. And then I ran around the house locking things, as if that was going to make everything okay. Lock the front door, then you'll be all right. And I mean, I immediately thought, this is very dangerous because of the nature of the Iranian regime and its willingness to use assassination as a weapon. But I was still hoping that this was largely rhetorical. I mean, I had to go immediately afterwards. I'd said I'd go to the London studios of CBS Television, because I was supposed to do a live interview into the morning show here. And I showed up there, and this news was all over the place. And I remember asking a lot of the journalists who were wandering around what they made of it, and how seriously should one take it. And I remember there was this foreign correspondent there who said, "Oh, don't worry about it." He said that Khomeini sentences the President of the United States to death every Friday afternoon. And I wanted to believe that. I want to think, okay, it's just rhetoric. It's just, somebody shaking a fist and making a noise. And unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And I think by the end of the day, I was in touch with the police, and the general view is that it was very serious.
And at that moment, did you think? And I think you make it plain that sooner or later in this book that you thought, my time is up.
Yeah, no, I thought
I'm dead.
I did. I mean, I thought I was probably going to be killed quite soon. I mean, and then the next morning, I was visited by a couple of gentlemen from the British intelligence services, as well as police officers. There's these two separate things. There's the spies and the police and the secret police, and I mean, they work together, but they're different. Basically, the spies, the intelligence services, their job is to assess the level of the threat against any individual. How dangerous is it? And then it's the police's job to decide what protection needs to be given.
How quickly did it take? Did the life of, as it were, internal exile and complete protection take shape?
Well, within like the next morning. And then a number of things happened, which I don't know, in retrospect, I wonder if I did the right thing. Because, first of all, the reason for having done the wrong thing is that everybody thought it would be over in a few days. Everybody, including the police. That this was outrageous. That the head of state of a foreign country should point across the world and order the murder of a British citizen in his own country who had committed no crime. Impossible. How could this happen? This was the late 20th century. And it would
in the midst, by the way, of a historical wave of freedom, not unfreedom.
Amazing year,
in Europe, yeah.
Amazing year. I mean, well, some of it not so good. Tiananmen not so good.
Less good. Yes.
But fall of communism, the freedom of Nelson Mandela, all these things happened that year, and a little later. Anyway, everybody thought this is going to get fixed because it's so outrageous that it can't stand. And so the police said to me, let's just go away somewhere for a few days. Let's just lie low. Don't stick your head up too much. Let the diplomats do their work. Let the politicians do their work. It'll be fixed. And I agreed to that, not to go home, and literally never went home again. When I left the house in the clothes I stood up in, never went home again. And instead of taking a few days, it took a decade before it was fixed.
Salman, one of the remarkable things about this book is that it's often, in the midst of this tragedy and robbery of a life for a decade or more, hilariously funny.
There was, even at the time, friends of mine and I would say to each other that if it wasn't for the fact that this isn't funny at all, it would be quite funny. So, for instance, also I learned, because the police, who I got to know quite well, have a particular line in black comedy. And I kind of internalized some of this. So, for instance, there was a police driver who was known to all his colleagues as the King of Spain. And, I mean, he wasn't Spanish or anything. I said, why is he called the King of Spain? Eventually, they told me that one day he had been guarding he'd left his police Jaguar unattended to go into a shop and buy some cigarettes. And when he came out, the Jag had been stolen, right? And he was called the King of Spain because if you say the name of the King of Spain slowly, his name is Juan Carlos.
And one of the things and now this is not the first time you've ever invented a name for yourself in a book, but in real life you had to invent a name for yourself, and you came up with it. Well, explain. Joseph and Anton are the first names of two
Yeah,
of your favorite
the name
writers.
was to serve two purposes, really. One was because I needed to, I needed to rent places to live, I needed to write checks, and I needed to do all sorts of things which obviously shouldn't be done in my own name. So, I mean, the bank manager was in on it and almost nobody else. That was one thing, but the other reason was that the police wanted to train themselves to not use my actual name by accident. That if they were, going, because these are very active men, it was difficult for them to be cooped up. So they were always going for walks and runs around the block and stuff like that. And they didn't want to accidentally say, oh, Salman said, pick up a bar of soap, have somebody hear it and kind of blow the cover. So they said, you have to choose a name that we can use. And so, and then they said, don't choose an Indian name, it's too obvious. So I thought this is very, A, to be asked to give up your name, and then to be asked to give up, like, the ethnicity of your name. It's quite, it's profound. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so I thought if I can't have India, then I can have literature, which is like the other country,
That you live in.
Yeah. And so I eventually made up this name from the first names of Conrad and Chekhov, hence Joseph Anton. And
why them?
Well, partly because it sounded like it might exist, unlike some of the,
Vladimir Pynchon.
Vladimir Joyce,
Yeah.
Marcel Beckett, not happening. Joseph Anton, maybe.
Maybe.
But also I thought, here's what I thought. I thought Chekhov, I thought I was in a funny way in a mixture of the worlds of Conrad and Chekhov, if you could even imagine such a thing. That, Chekhov, this great poet of alienation and melancholy and people in one place wishing they were somewhere else, and I thought, I've got three sisters too, yearning for a Moscow to which they couldn't return. I thought I'm sort of that's in a way my condition, and Conrad, after all, it's not just that he writes about the heart of darkness, but it's also that he has all these secret agents and plots and conspiracies and revolutions and explosions in his writings. I thought that wasn't inappropriate. And then there was this sentence from, the now improperly named Nigger of the Narcissus, in which the title character, this sailor called James Waite, is dying of tuberculosis on a ship. And one of his shipmates says to him at one point, why did you get on the ship? I mean, if you knew you were sick, why didn't you stay home? Why did you get on the ship? And he says, rather, it's a famous line, he says, I must live till I die, mustn't I? And I thought that line, I must live till I die, became for me like a sort of motto.
But while you were absorbing and then enduring this unimaginable condition of life, with death looming all around, you had every reason to believe that you could expect the support, the stalwart support, at the very minimum, of champions of the First Amendment and freedom of expression, meaning writers. You didn't get that.
Well, I got it from lots of writers, let's be fair.
That's true.
I did. And then there were some who were less supportive, some of whom were surprising. I mean, I remember being very surprised by the opposition of someone like John Berger, for example. Here's an old school Marxist, the old British left, as secular and non-religious a writer as you could wish to find. And yet there he was in the newspaper accusing me of, opportunism, doing it to make money. And
John le Carré too, David Cornwall.
And John le Carré as well, yes. John le Carré I can sort of almost understand because I gave one of his books a bad review. We're talking about writers here.
Yeah.
And I mean, truthfully, I wish it hadn't happened with le Carré. I mean, Kurt Vonnegut got cross too because I wrote a bad review of one of his books. I stopped doing book reviews after that.
Yeah.
I thought, you don't make any friends. You get a book and you give it a rave review.
But how do you understand that kind of resistance to what should be an absolute automatic support?
Well, I'll tell you what I think, in retrospect. I think at the time that this thing happened, nobody, including me, nobody really had a context for it. Nobody had a kind of narrative to set it into, and so it just seemed like exceptional and bizarre. It seemed like a one-off, and it was easy for people to think, well, if he's annoyed them that much, he must have done something really annoying.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, we don't understand their culture, but he does. And so if they're that angry, he must have done something that really annoyed them. And that's because, as I say, there wasn't this larger narrative.
Did any of these offenders come back and say, you know, I was wrong?
John le Carré, I mean, I haven't seen him since then, but I saw an interview that he gave in which he rather sweetly said that he thought maybe he'd been wrong. But if he'd been wrong, he said, he'd been wrong for the right reason. Whatever that means.
Whatever that means.
Exactly.
I wouldn't even dare to ask you.
No, but I mean,
means.
this is just injured, or just pride speaking. It doesn't matter. I mean, my fight's not with John le Carré. I think he's a fine writer, you know. There's only one thing that he said that I think it's important to take issue with. Where he said, I mean, I'll paraphrase it. He said something like, if you take on a known enemy, after that, you're not allowed to cry foul. So if you know what they're like, and then, you know, you goad them, and then they respond as you must have known they would, you can't then say, help. See? Which sounds sensible, except that it eliminates one of the most magnificent things about the history of literature, which is that writers have always done this.
The capacity to provoke.
Writers have always taken on tyrants and confronted them and, you know, spoken truth to power and often exposed themselves to great danger by doing so. You know, when Mandelstam wrote his poem about Stalin, he knew what Stalin was like. You know, Lorca knew what Franco was like. You know, it's actually one of the most glorious things about the history of literature, that writers have gone up against known enemies and told them the truth about themselves.
Now, in Satanic Verses, when you were doing what you were doing in the composition of that book, did you have any precedents, any foreknowledge of, as it were, going up against Islamic orthodoxy?
No, not really, because the weird thing is, I thought the book was actually quite respectful about Islam. I mean, yes, it was the point of view of somebody not religious. It's like it's a secular retake, you know, on that story. And remember that in the novel, the religion's not called Islam and the prophet's not called Muhammad and the city's not called Makkah, and it's all happening as a dream sequence in the mind of somebody who's going insane. Now, this is what we in the trade call fiction. But nevertheless, yes, of course, it was the origin story of Islam that inspired it. And I thought, I'm asking two serious questions. One is about the nature of revelation, and the other is about how a new idea behaves both in weakness and in strength. You know, when it's weak, does it compromise? When it's strong, is it merciful? You know, and I think in both those measures, the early history of Islam comes out quite well.
Now, your condition of that decade had phases within it. I know this because in 1991, late 1991, you came to New York in a kind of secret mission and were interviewed in a hotel room with bulletproof curtains by my wife for the New York Times, and then spoke very quickly at Columbia, and off you went again.
Because they threw me out of the country the moment I finished speaking. I mean, the moment the applause began, I was sort of grabbed and thrown onto a plane and hurled out of the country. They didn't want me around any longer.
The United States behaved badly, is what
No, they didn't actually. What happened is that the United States said to me, would I please not come, because they were hostages in Lebanon. You know, and there were negotiations.
Terry Waite and...
Yeah, well, also American hostages. Right. And there were negotiations underway to get them out. And they said, please don't come till we've done that. And to be fair to the U.S. authorities, the day that the last American hostage was released, they said, fine, no problem, you can come if you want. You know? So in that sense, they actually behaved, you know, they did what they said they'd do. And that's when I was able to come to speak at Columbia. In this, in this
and
hotel.
Things got a bit better.
This hotel on the Upper East Side with
the Mark
bulletproof
Hotel
mattresses on the windows. And I mean, you talk about comedy moments. I was met at the airport by this 11-vehicle motorcade with, in the center of it...
That normally doesn't happen on book tour.
Not too much.
No.
And the center of it, an armored white stretch limo. That was for me, right? Just in case you wanted to be low profile.
You're like Don King.
Yeah. Exactly like that, rushing through Harlem at high speed with everybody in Harlem out on the street saying, who dat? Anyway, so there was this police officer who I call Lieutenant Bob in the book, who was, I think, clinically insane, actually. Anyway.
But in a nice way.
In a nice way. Yeah. I said, Lieutenant Bob, this is a lot. You know, wouldn't it be better to put me in like a second-hand Buick and drive me through the back streets? Yeah. He looked pityingly at me, and he said, "No, sir, that would not be better." And I said, "Well, who else would you do this for? I mean, this is a hell of a lot. Who else would you do this for?" He said, "Sir, it's what we do for Arafat."
Nice.
So at this point, I understood what it's like to be the leader of the PLO in New York. And then I said, "Well, supposing it was the president, Lieutenant Bob, what extra would you do? What would you do more? Because this seems like everything. What else would you do?" And he said, "Well, sir, if you were the president of these United States, you close down a lot of these streets here, sir, and we'd have men up on the roofs there, sir. We'd probably have a helicopter or two. We didn't do that in your case because we thought it would look too conspicuous."
I'm wondering what the effect of this life had on the life of the imagination, a now very crowded imagination, crowded by a sense of fatalism, a sense of inability to communicate with friends and family at least on a regular basis, even though you had very tight ring, the iron ring, I think you referred to it, of friends and your sons.
You know, I think I was saved by being a novelist. I think if I'd been, for instance, supposing it had been a play, supposing the Satanic Verses was a play and I was a playwright, it would have been very, very hard for me to go on working. It would have been very hard to get, theaters to be willing to put on work by me and so on like that. I think because I did something which you could do alone in a room, I was able to go on doing it. And I think it actually saved me. That I did writers, know what it's like to sit alone in a room for hours a day, staring out of the window, wondering what the fuck to do next, And so that was not unfamiliar. And just that ability to have an interior life, to go into the imagination.
But what I'm asking was your interior life impinged upon, robbed from you in any way the way your exterior life?
Well, I mean, it did for a while. I mean, it was up and down. There were moments when it was worse than at other times. And it wasn't just that it was all frightening and all that. It was also that once I had to start organizing a political campaign, to try and bring pressure on the Iranians to do something about this. I mean, if you're one person and you have small human rights groups helping you out and a few friends, it's very, very limited resources. It's extremely difficult to try and arrange an international political campaign to get to meet.
Pre-internet.
Yeah, pre-internet, but just to get into the room with powerful people in various countries, it's really hard, And so there were certainly a couple of years when it was like a full-time job.
Who on a public level, on a political level, acted early and decently?
Well, interestingly, see, the British attitude was always quietism. It was always, yes, we'll give him the protection, we'll keep him alive, and what we'll do is just, if everybody can just shut up about this, including him preferably,
it'll
gradually
calm down.
It'll gradually fade away. And one of the things I knew is that wasn't going to happen. And so,
and you knew it, why?
Because I knew who I was dealing with, and one of the things about the Iranian regime is that, a lack of confrontation is always interpreted as weakness, and so they would certainly. Why would they stop? They had no downside. Why would they cancel it if nobody was making it necessary for them to cancel it? In the end, states, as we know, act in their own self-interest. And so I always thought you have to create a situation in which there's so much pressure on the Iranians that they understand that it is in their self-interest to get rid of this problem, and that's the moment at which they'll do it. So and we thought if the Brits won't take that lead, we have to see what other countries might, and hopefully activate the Brits if there's enough of them. And initially, the countries that were helpful were the Scandinavian countries, particularly Norway, but to a certain degree Denmark and Sweden as well, and then Canada, and then France. And unsurprisingly, these are countries which have historically been very closely associated with human rights issues, and they reacted in that way.
One of the many dimensions of the book is there's obviously the detailed, granular dimension of the personal story and the various relationships going on here, but there's also a capacity in the book to, in the fullness of time, to see what this affair meant historically in relation to larger historical forces as a kind of precursor, as you say, to even 9/11.
Yeah.
So where do you place the, you'll forgive me, the Rushdie affair with what's going on, what's been happening in the last 20 years?
Well, it's the same now. I think, you see, what's what I was saying earlier, that back then we didn't have a narrative in which to place this event, you know, and now we do. I mean, now we've seen how in this 24 years since the publication of the book, that narrative is now pretty well known. And yes, 9/11 obviously was a very big moment in that.
What is that narrative, though?
Well, it's two things. It's on the one hand the growth of a highly aggressive form of Islam which is willing to use extreme violence to serve its ends. And the other is what I and other people have begun to call the outrage industry. You know, I mean, we live in an age in which identity politics has developed into a thing where you define your identity by the things that outrage you. You know, you define yourself by what you hate, not by what you love.
But this isn't unique to Islam.
No.
It may be seeing its eruptions more often now in Islam than elsewhere.
Yeah.
But
it's by no means unique to
yeah.
Islam. No. But you put that together with Islamic fanaticism as expressed, for example, by Al-Qaeda, you know, and you see how the two things put together become an explosive combination. And I mean, I think you can draw pretty much a straight line from the attack on the Satanic Verses through attacks on many other people in the years that followed to the 9/11 attacks. And one of the things I tried to show was that this was not a unique event, that in those years that followed the attack on my book, there were attacks on many writers, intellectuals, journalists, philosophers across the Muslim world, many of whom were murdered by Islamic fanatics.
And we should say people associated with your book, translators, and people also killed.
Yeah, also. Well, the Japanese translator, Professor Igarashi, was killed, and there were attempts to kill several other people who were badly injured and fortunately survived. But, you know, for instance, one of the most important Turkish journalists, Ugur Mumcu, was killed by Islamic fanatics. The Egyptian philosopher Farag Foda was murdered, and the Egyptian Nobel laureate Najib Mahfouz was stabbed in the neck and only just survived. The Algerian novelist Tahar Jaout was murdered. And in all these cases, the allegations against these people were these same medieval crimes. That
Blasphemy.
Were, you know, heresy, apostasy, blasphemy, crimes we hadn't heard of since the Spanish Inquisition. You know, and suddenly these were reasons for killing people. You know, and I would try and argue this. I would try and say, look, just look what's happening. You know, and very often people in the West would hear what I was saying as self-justification. You know, he's trying to make excuses by showing that this is happening to other people. It felt like special pleading.
Do you feel that this has changed your politics from, say, the politics you might have had on February 13th, 1989, in any way?
Well, in this way, yes, that I think that I've been quite disappointed. I mean, I've always seen myself as somebody, sort of roughly speaking, on the left, you know. I mean, so, and I still certainly don't see myself as being on the right, because look who's there. But I have been very disappointed very often by the reactions of the left. As, for example, in that case I was mentioning about John Berger. And I really don't fully understand it, but to an extent, I think it's to do with, like, one of the reflex positions of the Western left is that the people can't be wrong, you know. So if there's a large number of the people of whatever community who object to a given individual, the given individual must be wrong. You can't have a kind of mass erroneous reaction. You know, it's not allowed. History's not like that. You know?
So your view of this altered?
My view of that altered, because in my view, in this case, the people, thanks to the way they were guided and led and so on, were pretty wrong. And then there's, of course, in the European left, there's a kind of default setting which is anti-American. And so the people who were anti-American, which were to do with which meant Islamic radicals, made a kind of curious alliance with the European left, you know, because of their joint opposition to, you know, your enemy's enemy is your friend, and there was some of that. But it was very odd, and I think it goes on even now, because what has developed in this period, this quarter century, is to a much greater degree than it existed before, is the idea of cultural relativism. You know, the idea that you have to treat different communities differently because of their different cultural heritage.
Or stages of development.
Yeah, so what it means is that while you may strongly object to what? Female circumcision, are we supposed to tolerate this in cultures which still think it's okay? You know, and so on. I mean, that I felt...
And yet your politics are not the same as, say, Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
No. I mean, there's things I agree with Ayaan about, but not everything. I mean, I think she has moved pretty firmly to the right. You know, and so there's lots of areas where I think we wouldn't agree. But I mean, you know, personally, I like her. I think she's a brave woman. She's stood up for what she believes in, even if I don't always agree with it. But this idea of separate treatment for separate cultures, I think essentially, if we follow that to its conclusion, destroys our ability to have a really moral framework for a society.
The fatwa more or less officially ended after a decade.
Yeah.
And yet, several weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I went to the annual, what I call the Mahmoud Ahmadinejad breakfast.
Oh, yes.
Wouldn't miss it for the world. First time I went, they served lox and bagels, unironically.
He does.
True story.
He does stand up.
He is a funny guy. And there are 20 reporters and editors sitting around a table, and there's Ahmadinejad and translators and so on. And there were questions about Israel and bombs and all this, and sanctions and all the rest. And it was my turn, and I asked him about you. And rather than just say, you know, the fatwa ended and let's move on to another question, he gave a grin that could only be described as maybe satanic and impish at the same time, if that's possible, and said, where is this Rushdie? Where does he live? He ought to be careful of where he is.
I think this was Ahmadinejad's idea of a joke, I think.
It was very funny.
Yeah. No, you see why he doesn't make a career in that field.
But you live your life now, Salman, as freely as anybody.
Yeah, really.
Can.
I mean, there are things I can't do. I mean, there are countries in the world I can't go to. I mean, either because they won't let me in, or because it would be stupid to go there. You know, because the danger would be pretty
And they
great.
are?
Well, they're essentially the Islamic world, you know, the countries of Islamic majority population. I mean, as I say, sometimes I can't.
So you can't go to Pakistan where your parents.
No, you know, both my parents are buried in Pakistan. I mean, when my mother died, I was not allowed a visa to go and bury her. And not only that, but there were articles in the newspapers there saying that anybody who went to her funeral should go and apologize to God at the local mosque because she was the mother of, you know, of my mother. And you can imagine that doesn't endear me to Pakistan. It is true, actually, that if I had gone, it would have been colossally dangerous. Because you see what Pakistan's become. I mean,
but even India's complex for you. We should point out that India banned the satanic verses.
First.
And by the way, I don't believe it's lifted the ban.
No, but fortunately, we live in an age in which you can't ban books.
Right.
Because there's this thing
not effectively.
There's a thing called the Kindle.
Yeah.
So if you're in India and you want to buy the static verses, you can download it to be delivered to you, you know, so... which makes the kind of official ban even more ludicrous.
But, you know, most people in this room think of India, and they think of the world's largest democracy, freedom of speech, and so on. And it shocked me in my ignorance going there to the Jaipur Literary Festival that it became impossible for you to go because of threats of violence and all kinds of...
India hasn't been quite as liberal as it used to be for some time. And I think in many ways, the banning of the satanic verses back in 1988 started something. you know, because what it did was...
Right, you're not alone in this.
What it did was to create a kind of bidding war between different religious communities. Oh, if the Muslims can get that banned, said the Hindus, then we want that banned. And then the Sikhs said, we want that banned, you know, and suddenly there was this escalation.
And these constituencies are so enormous in electoral politics that you can't resist it.
But what has happened now, I mean, it's very worrying, and I think I actually did go to India about a month after the Jaipur festival, and I went, you know, to Delhi, the capital, not to this small provincial town, and no problem, because suddenly there wasn't an election on where somebody was trying to win the Muslim vote by attacking.
And nobody cared.
Nobody cared. In fact, some of the less scrupulous bits of the Indian media went to the people who had made trouble at Jaipur and said, look, he's over there. You know, aren't you going to make a fuss? He's right over there. And they said,
So we're going to get you to ask questions in a couple of minutes. I want to ask about the book in particular. And remember, when you do ask questions, please make it a question and not something more developed and declarative than that. In 2005, you were asked in an interview in the Paris Review whether you would ever write a memoir, and certain editors have been nudging you about this for some time. And you said the following: until the whole fatwa thing happened, it never occurred to me that my life was interesting enough. I would just write my novels and hopefully those would be interesting, but who cares about the writer's life? Then this very unusual thing happened to me, and I found myself keeping an occasional journal just to remind myself what was happening. When things went back to normal, it occurred to me that a memoir would be a way of being done with it. Nobody would ever ask me about it again. But then I realized I'd have to spend a year researching it, at least a year writing it, and at least a year talking about it. So I'd be sentencing myself to 3 or 4 more years of the thing I just got out of. I didn't think I could bear to go forward.
Yeah, well, that's what I thought for a long time. I thought it was the last thing I wanted to write. You know, I wanted to slam the door on those years and go back to the life I'd wanted, you know, write novels and stories and so on. But I always knew that I would write it one day, you know, because good story, you know. And I didn't want anybody else to. I thought if anybody's going to do that, I'm going to do it first, you know. I mean, I remember there was a moment when Christopher Hitchens told me that he had met the film director Milos Forman, who had sent a message via Christopher to say that he was interested to make a film of my life. So on the one hand, I was very flattered because I loved his films and so on. But I was slightly less flattered when he added that he saw it as a companion piece to his film about Larry Flint.
It's a good point, though.
But anyway, I thought I'm going to tell this one day. And I remember I used to say jokingly to people that I thought of it as my old age pension, that, you know, when I was old and had nothing to write, I would write this story and it would, like, pay the hospital bills, you know. And I mean, I'm almost there.
You could always go into the textile business.
But that's, I mean, I knew that I would tell it, but truthfully, I just wanted to wait until I felt in a calm place. I wanted to wait until I felt I was able to do what one should do, which is to reflect in tranquility, you know, to look back objectively, rather than write when the emotion of that time was still boiling up in me, you know.
And how did you go about figuring out how to do it? One distinguishing feature is the name, another is the third-person narrator, which you've talked about quite a lot. But also there's the form of the nonfiction novel, In Cold Blood, The Right Stuff, Execution of Song. Yeah. Now, how do you feel about that form? Would all this pass the fact checkers of a certain magazine, or did you feel freer than that?
A chunk of it did pass the fact checkers.
It did. I can vouch for that.
But which, as you know, is
no joke.
Is a blessing in the end.
In the end. In the end.
You're always grateful for it in the end.
Yes.
Always. Because
like surgery.
Like dentistry. Yeah. Anyway, without Novocaine.
I'll let them know.
But I really thought it's a novel in which everything's true. And the only difference between it and those books you mentioned, all of which I admire, you know, is that those writers were not writing about their own life. They're writing about, you know, if Tom Wolfe's writing The Right Stuff,
sure,
it's about other people, and similarly with the Mailer book and so on. So I thought, how do I do this if it's my life rather than somebody else's life? And I think that's one of the reasons why, for the third person, is just to be able to, you know, if you have an I and then a lot of he and she's, the I is just by the use of the pronoun separated from the he and she's, you know. But if everything is he and she, then all the characters in the book are at the same level of existence, if you know what I mean. And so I thought it was possible for me then to write about myself in this way, as you would write about a fictional character, except that everything's true. You know? But what I mean is, how would you write about a fictional character? You don't keep secrets about a fictional character. You know, you reveal the inmost self of the fictional character. That's what you're supposed to do. You know, a novel is there to bring somebody alive on the page as vividly and profoundly as you can do so.
And one of the many things I love about this book is that there's no, in the Seinfeld show they used to say no phony hugging or no false reconciliation or whatever it is. There's a sense of dispassion about it. There's no phony forgiveness handed out like party gifts, like swag at the end of this book. Some people come off awfully badly, and at one point, so do you.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I think if it was only other people coming off badly, while everything I did was
heroic and
wonderful, that, you know, people would see through that in a second. I mean, I think you have to. I thought that one of the going-in positions was, if you're going to tell the kind of unvarnished truth about other people, you have to also tell the unvarnished truth about yourself. And in a way, you have to be more critical of yourself than anyone else. You know, and
the key episode of that is?
Well, the key episode of that is this appalling moment at the end of 1990 when I tried to, under a lot of, I mean, I could justify it. I could say I was under all kinds of pressure and so on to do this, when I tried to make this accommodation with Islamic leaders, and it was, you know, it was a pathetic and stupid mistake. And I mean, there's one of the interesting things I think is that the chapter in the book which deals with that is called The Trap of Wanting to be Loved. And I think what I meant by that is that I actually did have this, what looks in retrospect like a demented belief, that I could talk my way out of this.
Yeah.
You know, that I could just say to people, look, just sit down, let me explain to you what I thought I was doing, where it was coming from, and, you know, I'm not a bad guy. And now that you understand it, you see, you're not upset anymore. And let's be friends.
It didn't work.
And I mean, how stupid that was.
Yeah.
But still, I did think it from it. And at the end of that sort of failed and sort of stupid attempt at appeasement, I just understood something. I thought, you know, there are going to be people who don't like you. Whatever you say, they're not going to like you. And you know what? It's okay, because you're not crazy about them either.
And Salman, we'll finish our part of this with, I'd ask you to tell the story of the closest you got to getting killed.
Right.
Took place in Australia.
In Australia,
And it wasn't a hit team.
No. Well, this was 1995, and The Moor's Last Sigh had just been published. And with incredible, I can only say, labyrinthine convolutions, I had managed to arrange a weird book tour which took in South America and Australasia. And I had gone from, you know, Argentina, Chile, round Cape Horn, across the dateline, up to New Zealand, eventually Australia, and finished this book tour in Australia, and got the Australian police to agree that since everybody thought I was leaving to go back home, that I could actually stay. And I had writer friends in Australia, one of whom invited me to his little beach house down in the sort of bottom right-hand corner of Australia, and said, why don't you come and have Christmas? Come and spend Christmas, you know, in the sun for once. And my wife, Elizabeth West, was with me, and my older son, Milan, who was then, Zafar, rather, sorry, I do this all the time. Zafar came out to be with us. We thought, we'll have Christmas in Australia. Why not? You know, what fun. And so after all the official bit ended, we rented a car. We were driving south from Sydney. And we went into this small village, really, with the sort of ironically accurate name of Milton, a town named after a blind poet. And we were hit by a very large truck, which almost killed us, which pushed us off the road, and we smashed into a tree, writing off the car. And in most cases, all three of us would have been killed. By a miracle, we all walked away from it without a broken bone. And I then discovered that this truck was carrying a very large load of fertilizer. So it essentially was hit by a truckload of shit. and almost killed by it. And then we were sitting there on the grassy verge of this road, and we were lucky because as it happened, there was a little hospital in this town. And so the ambulance arrived very quickly and saw me sitting there on the verge, and the ambulance driver said, "Excuse me, sir, I suppose it's not the best time, but could I have an autograph?" And I thought, you know, give the man an autograph. He's got the ambulance. and then the police arrived and started interrogating the poor truck driver about his connections to Islamic terrorist groups. He was just some Aussie truck driver. I don't think he had any idea who I was, but he was having to answer questions about his alleged membership of Al Qaeda. Anyway, I just think it's extraordinary, really, and that's what I mean about, you see, if it weren't not funny, it would be funny. The closest I actually came to being killed was that truckload of shit.
A load of shit. Questions from the audience? I can't...
You have to bring the lights up, though.
Yes, bring the lights up just a teeny bit so we can see who's who. This fellow is ambling toward the mic, yeah?
Oh, yeah, right.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. My question to you is, I'm sure you had a lot of time to think about in your time under this fatwa. Like, what's your theory as to why some cultures have more tolerance for freedom of expression than others? Thank you.
You know, the truth is that most of the world is not very tolerant about freedom of expression. You know, try saying what you want to say in China, for example. It's really the other way around. What has happened because of a series of historical episodes like the French Enlightenment, that a part of the world, to say Western Europe and America, has developed an idea of freedom of expression which is very precious, you know, and which actually far exceeds the amount of freedom offered to people in most of the world, all of whom seem to want it. You know, and if you look at the kids who were demonstrating in Tahrir Square last year, that was part of what they wanted. They wanted to live in a more open society where they could speak their mind. But I've often thought that this is a privilege that we have that was hard won, you know, and that the writers of the French Enlightenment who fought this fight, you know, on our behalf, Montesquieu, Diderot, Rousseau, Voltaire, they all knew that their enemy was not the state. Their enemy was the church. And in those days, the Catholic Church had at its disposal, you know, anathema, excommunication, a whole range of, you know, inquisitions. They had a whole range of methods by which they could try and limit what could be said. And it was explicitly the idea of the Enlightenment writers that the church had to be deprived of the power to place limiting points on thought. And that victory, because it was a victory, essentially gave us what we now think of as the modern idea of freedom of expression. And that, of course, came to this country in the form of Tom Paine, who was very influenced by those ideas and imported them into America, out of which comes the First Amendment. So we're lucky to have this, you know, and it was a battle against the church then. And what I came to feel about what was happening to the attack on the Satanic Verses and to, you know, other writers is that, you know, we thought this battle was long won. We didn't think we had to fight this battle anymore. This was just over. And then we discovered that sadly it's not over. It's a different church, same battle, you know. And so here we are fighting it again.
Over here.
Thank you. I live and study in Sudan, and so over the last few weeks it's been very present, this question of freedom of speech, as we had to lock ourselves away while the British, German and American embassies were attacked. And many of my Sudanese friends felt deeply offended by the videos, by the cartoons, and also deeply offended by the attacks on the embassies, because this wasn't what represented Islam. And yet I couldn't help ask myself as I was locked in my flat, is there a line where freedom of expression is simply just offensive and puts into danger diplomats' lives, as we saw in Libya, meant that diplomats had to be evacuated from Sudan, aid workers had to stay at home and not work, because people were very upset by what had been shown and written and drawn about Islam. Do you think there's a red line?
You know what, I don't think so. I don't think there is. Because what you're essentially saying is that the people who are willing to resort to violence get to decide where that line should be. And I just don't think you can do that. You know, the fact is, there is no right not to be offended. You know, it doesn't exist. And if you decide that there is, then almost everything can be offend somebody. You know, I mean, I can go into a bookstore and find things that offend me. It doesn't occur to me to burn the bookstore down.
Mm.
You know.
You mean like 50 Shades of Grey or something?
For example.
No.
You know.
No.
Yeah, like 50 Shades of Grey.
It's very disappointing, though.
I have to say, I don't know how much of it you've read, David.
Enough.
I don't think men read this book, but I did go so far as to as to read chapter 1 on the Amazon site, and I must say, I've never read anything so badly written that got published. Mm. I mean, it makes Twilight look like War and Peace. Which was my previous record holder for worst written book that got published. Yeah. And it doesn't occur to me.
I know.
So this culture which says that if it offends me, you know, look, YouTube is full of offensive material. You know, if you want to find something on YouTube that really pisses you off, you can find it. There it is. YouTube is gigantic and full of crap, and you know, I mean, some good stuff. But if we're going to live in this age which exists and is not going to stop existing, this information age, in which vast amounts of material are just out there, because anybody can put it out there, you know, we can't allow a situation to exist where somebody says, if you put that up there, we're going to attack your country. You know, I mean, what America has to do with this video, you know, is negligible, and it's completely. I mean, put it like this: if we don't hold people who commit acts of violence responsible for the violence they commit, then we no longer live in a moral universe guided by law. You know, I mean, I could say something here that might annoy David. I mean, I have to try hard because it's not easy to annoy him. But if I did, if he were then to get out a gun and shoot me, that would be his fault. It wouldn't be my fault. He would be the person who would be rightly sent to jail for that. You know, the criminal is responsible for the crime. You know, to say, oh, I was upset and that's why I burned your house down, doesn't mean that you're not an arsonist. You know, and I think we just have to, we're in danger of getting this upside down. That we're allowing the people who are willing to resort to extreme violence to set the terms of the debate. And that mustn't be allowed to happen, in my view.
Over here. I think we have time for one more here and one more there.
There's a lot here.
Sorry about that.
I'll try and give short answers. Yes, no. No.
What is your view of the Obama administration and its prosecution of more whistleblowers than any other president? And I'm thinking particularly of Bradley Manning and the WikiLeaks matter.
Oh gosh, I can't say yes or no to that, can I?
You could.
I don't know. Can I just pass? That's too complicated. I mean, I feel sorry for Bradley Manning, not least because of the way in which he's been exploited by Julian Assange. A person that I have very little admiration for, while at the same time I can find it, you know, I can find that I can support WikiLeaks without being particularly fond of Mr. Assange and his self-glorification. Yeah.
I have two short questions for you.
One short question.
One is,
that way we can get one more.
Right. One is, do you think the fatwa affected you creatively as a writer? As in, did you become a different kind of a writer after the fatwa?
You see, I think the answer is, I hope the answer is no, because I think
3 books, 4
that if you if you had never heard anything about me at all, and all you had in front of you was the shelf of my books, and you were to read them, I don't think you would say, oh, look, something terrible happens to him in 1989. And after that, it's all different. I don't think you'd say that. I mean, I think the books have, they're going on their own journey. And I tried very consciously, it's one of the things I am proud of. I said to myself, you must live until you die. Be the writer that you are. Go on doing the work that you set out to do. Go down your road. Don't be deflected by it. Write your own books, etc. And that was very much a conscious desire of mine. And I think I did things that were wrong. That's one of the things I feel that I did right.
You have the enormous burden of asking the last question.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity. My question is about self-examination, self-criticism, and you spoke about countries that deprive people of the freedom to speak, and like, let's say, in China. But what about people who live in the United States and don't express their feelings that what had happened to you, or some obscure movie that was produced in Hollywood would then lead to so much violence in the Middle East? I want to know, do you agree with me that there should be more expression against maybe what they claim is, the belief in Islam is preventing them even for non-traditionalists?
Well, I'm not sure I completely understand your question, but I think the point about an open society is that you should be able to say whatever the hell you want,
No, but what I mean is I don't see a lot of support, or I don't see a lot of expression against the violence that had taken place. And I wonder why we allow freedom of speech here. Why don't I see more of that?
I can't answer your question, but I agree with you in general that violent attacks should be criticized, of course. And I don't know. I don't know that you're right about that. I think there probably has been quite a lot of criticism.
I saw very few articles.
Okay, thanks. We need to end with not a question, but an unassailable truth. That is, your life will be a great deal richer when you read this book, and I hope you will. And I want to thank Salman Rushdie for everything, and not just today. Thank you.